Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oops. There we go. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thanks. I guess I have to call you Director Stedman as opposed to Juanita. So Shelby and I are glad to be here today. I'm Tom Rollins. I'm Director of the Division of Family and Children's Services. We got a bunch of my folks here today, and I'm very glad to see all of you. Both are, it's kind of fun. I got in last night and got here about probably about 5:30, and the reception was winding down, and I came in and saw like everybody I hadn't seen in 6 months in one room. It was kind of fun. So glad to be with y'all. I want to talk a little bit today. We're going to give you an overview of the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is completely misnamed. We'll get into that in a minute. And then Shelby Zimmer, who is one of our bright lights in this agency and is running our work implementing this law, and are going to have sort of a conversation about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're talking about. So first of all, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I think some of y'all have been around long enough to remember when ASFA was implemented, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. Some of y'all may have been around long enough to know when, so how many of you here were here, how many have been here in this work long enough to remember when the 1974, I think, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed? Anybody? Okay, well, maybe not. So let's talk a little bit about where we've come and gone in child welfare in the last, it's kind of hot here, so take off the jacket. Where we've come and gone in the last 100 years. 100 and something years ago, 150 years ago about, the American, I think the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals actually did the first child welfare intervention in a court to save a little girl who was being abused. So thank God for people who care about animals. And that actually was sort of the kickoff of child welfare and the connection between government and the courts and individuals protecting children. And then, of course, we've come a long way since then. We actually, at one point, our child welfare system involved sending children on trains to Oklahoma to work on farms. Y'all know about that? The orphan trains. So that was, an interesting idea. And then, of course, we get into the 1920s, and you get into this, I guess the first juvenile court was created in 1899. You get in the 1920s, we start worrying about children working in factories, and we get the New Deal, and we get the Social Security Act, and we get Title 4E of the Social Security Act, and we actually start cranking up the idea that government has a role in protecting children. And then in, I think, 1960s, something like that, we have the realization through some medical folks that child abuse, severe child abuse, is a lot more widespread than we realized. We actually start tracking it. And then we come up with a multidisciplinary team. And then we come up with the adoption and, I can't remember the name of it, it's the basic child welfare federal law, the Adoption Assistance and Something Act. And we start putting children, like sort of overseeing federally the state's work in putting children in foster care. And then we realized that children are drifting around in foster care, so we passed the Adoption and Safe Families Act that is designed to make sure we're doing reasonable efforts to keep them out of foster care and to move them to a permanent home as soon as possible. All this is to say that over the last 150 years, we've tried a lot of different stuff. And it has all sometimes worked and sometimes hasn't worked. We're in a weird situation now where we have for the last 50 years almost now, subsidized foster care. We have told, the federal government has told the states, if you put a child in foster care, then we will pay you money. And so we have had incentives to put children in foster care, even when we might realize that that child can be kept in his or her own home. But with this new law, we have reversed years and years of that incentivization and are now incentivizing, which is not really a word. How many of you are grammar Nazis? Incentivizing is not a word. It's not a word. We're giving incentives now to keep children out of foster care through the FFPSA. So essentially what we're dealing with is this. It's an opportunity for us to prevent unnecessary placement of children in foster care, to keep children and their families together, and of course to work more closely with relatives. We all know, as I said, that for years we have said, the federal government has said to the states, if you put a child in foster care, we'll pay for it. And so even when all of our good social workers out there and all of our multidisciplinary teams work together say, you know, this mother just needs some help. This child just needs some help. We said, well, you know, the best way to help them is to put them in foster care, and then we can get the feds to pay for it. Yay. Okay. Not exactly a great way to do things. Because why? Because we know that long before there was a government-run child welfare system, there were natural child welfare systems. The most basic and natural child welfare system, and this is reflected in history and tradition and faith and even in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention. The most natural child protection system is the parent. The stable parent. Why? Well, we know neurologically and scientifically that when a child is born, that child's ability to develop into a normal, well-rounded individual is based upon that child's ability to attach to a secure, loving, caregiving parent. That's how it was for eons when we lived on the savannas and when we migrated out of Africa into the Middle East and all across the world. Children were raised by parents. The other thing we know is that for eons, humans have lived in small tribes, usually family-based tribes, a family group. And that was our earliest sort of neighborhood, was the family. And so we know, and many of you know this personally, that if you are in a situation where your sister is not doing what she needs to do for her child, that you're going to do what you can to intervene. And so for years and years, on the farm, in the agricultural society in which we all as a society originated, that when the parent couldn't parent properly, somebody stepped in from the rest of the family to take care of their own. What else do we know? We know that we have, of course, developed as a society from parents to small tribes of individuals, usually family related, to the modern society in which we generally live in neighborhoods and we develop connections and relationships with people we don't know. But at the same time, we also know that historically we have cared for our neighbors. And historically, before there was a child welfare system, before there was a child protection system, if you had a parent who had a problem, if the family couldn't care about it, couldn't deal with it, then the neighborhood and the community did. Now, so what did we incentivize, and I'll use that word again, in our 4E funding for all these years? We incentivized, not the parent caring for the child, not the relative caring for the child, not the community stepping up to the plate, but the government reaching in to those older institutions and taking that child out of his or her own community and placing that child in foster care. Because we can get additional resources for the child by doing so. And I would hope you all agree with me that while foster care is necessary, and while the providers who are gathered here today who provide that service, whether it is foster care, whether it is a group home, whether it is community-based services, whatever you're doing, we need your help. But at the same time, folks, we also need to make sure that we are focused on keeping that child where that child needs to be. And what is that child, where does that child need to be? That child needs to be in a situation where he or she can be cared for by someone with whom he or she has a lasting, stable, trustworthy relationship. And so we have the opportunity through the Family First Prevention Services Act. Whatever we're going to talk about today really doesn't matter. What we have is an opportunity to focus back on these real basic, traditional structures of how we care for children. And so in Georgia, we are working to safely prevent removals to foster care through, what does that say? Targeted, effective, community-based prevention services.
Yes. Support
Support a model of extended family preservation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm sorry. It's fun. I'm having fun, people. Just laugh. All right. Skip. All right. Now, so the goal here, the opportunity here is for all of us to work together to do what we all know we should be doing to begin with. Okay? So, again, I'm going to skip the details for a moment and talk about something deeper. I cannot emphasize enough two things. First thing I want to emphasize is the importance of everybody who is gathered here today. How many of you have a group home? Anybody? All right, I can't see. It's like the lights are bad. All right. So, anybody here from the Methodist Children's Home in Macon? All right. Anyway, so I don't know, just kind of take them for example. I think the Methodist Children's Home was established in like 1850 something. Is that right? Now, what does that mean? That means that long before we had 4E, long before there was a Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, there were nice, caring Christian people who were taking in orphans and people and children who couldn't be cared for by their parents and caring for them and raising them and trying to give them a life that they deserve. And I think we need to make sure that as a state agency, we are honoring that prior work, and we are honoring all of those who have carried on that work by going out and raising funds to support children who are in need. And one of the things that Juanita and I have talked about so much over the past year with this family CFFPSA is the fear among our providers, especially our group home providers, that somehow we're going to end up killing the goose that laid the golden egg, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use. Folks, we're not doing that. We have an opportunity, however, for all of you who are providing services to make sure that we are focusing those services on the right of the child to live in a family-like setting, to be attached to his or her parents, if possible, to live with relatives, not because they're blood kin, but because they already have a relationship with the child, to go back to this basic circle I drew a minute ago, in which we as a state agency and all of us who work with abused and neglected children are, quite frankly, staying in our lane and respecting the right of that child to be in a community that he or she already knows, or he or she, sorry, I'm going to say she from now on, I'm a grammar Nazi, where she can be with parents, and if that's not possible, to be with a relative who she already knows, to go to the same school, to play with his or her friends, to not be ripped out and placed in a place far away. Now, that's our goal. The dilemma is that the federal government passes laws, and they don't always, they give us promises, but they don't always, the law doesn't always match the promise. So what they have said is, well, folks, we finally realize after 30 some odd years that we are probably wrongly incentivizing foster care. So we want to give you the ability to get these 4E federal reimbursement funds to keep families together and to keep families with relatives and to provide community-based services. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. You have to do it in the way we tell you to do it. So you can only use these funds for situations in which the child is a candidate for foster care. You can only use these funds for 3 types of services. Number 1, mental health services. Number 2, substance abuse services. Number 3, situations in which you're doing parent aid, parent counseling type services. And furthermore, we are going to very closely define what is a candidate for foster care. And furthermore, these services have to be based in evidence. And they have to be either well supported or something like that. Shelby's the expert. You can ask her. So we're in this weird situation now where, thank God, we have this incentive to do what's right for children as opposed to following the money. But yet we have all these additional restrictions and concerns and requirements. So what we're doing here in Georgia is doing our best to develop, number 1, an information technology system that will allow us to track these children. Because, you can have, we're dealing with, we're talking about thousands and thousands of children we deal with every day. And to be able to get the reimbursement, we have to know who is a candidate, what service they are getting, whether that service is evidence-based, when was it provided, who provided it, is it reimbursable under 4E? And so you can't do that without a really strong IT system. So we're developing that, and it's taking a while. We also have to better develop, I'm skipping ahead, I'm sorry. The determination of, hang on, where's that page, Shelby? Anyway, I don't know where it is. Here we go, Utah. So how do we determine who is a candidate for foster care? Okay, that's number 1. how do we determine what is a evidence-based program? Some of y'all, some of the things that are out there already on the clearinghouse, as they call it, which you can look at, are fine programs. Well, I think we do a lot of other programs in the state here already that should be qualified but are not yet, okay? So we're working, and Shelby's working with a number of you providers to make sure that these programs are categorized properly as evidence-based and well-supported so we can get reimbursed for them. And then, of course, as I said, we have these already. So we have Nurse Family Partnership, Healthy Families America, Parents as Teachers. There's other programs that are under review. But we need to make sure that we in Georgia are working with you to say, look, if you got a good program, where's Sally Buchanan? Is she here? Hey, Sally. You know, some of the programs you're doing are great. But we need to make sure that they are on this federal clearinghouse so we can get reimbursed for them. We know, I think, in general, that there are 3 types of services we will be able to provide, and they all are essentially, in my book, mental health services. So they are, in fact, mental health, substance abuse, and then parent aid services. So if you look back here, for example, at the Nurse Family Partnership or whatever, some of the home visiting programs, what do? We are sending skilled experts into the home to work with the family to make sure that whatever that little child is doing is not triggering a negative reaction from the parent. To make sure the parent understands the necessity of reading to that child and of bonding with that child. That the parent understands that in a chaotic home full of family violence and chronic craziness, that the child may end up with behavioral issues that need to be dealt with carefully. So that really is, in fact, a behavioral health type service. And then, of course, we have the more significant issues of things like multi-systemic therapy and methadone maintenance therapy, and these specific programs that are actually designed to deal with a parent's mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse issue. So, am I in charge of, as the head of DFACS, am I in charge of behavioral health for the state of Georgia? No. So what does that mean? That means that while I have all of y'all here in the room, that I need to also get you to work with me and with behavioral health and with the Department of Community Health in the Medicaid program to make sure that we can get, first of all, appropriately qualified to do these programs, and that we can get reimbursed for what are essentially our behavioral health services. So, let's get into a little bit of the details. As we know, currently you get 4E foster care maintenance payments, and then so under the new law, under Family First, we'll be able to identify children as a candidate for foster care, if they are a candidate for foster care, or if they are a candidate for re-entry into foster care. So 12 months before the child comes into care, and then for 12 months after the child goes back home. We can provide these 3 types of services, these substance abuse, mental health, parent aid, as long as they're qualified and on the clearinghouse, which is great. So here's my question. How many of you in this room right now provide community-based services? Okay. Do you feel qualified at this point to know what services you are going to be able to be reimbursed for under Family First? Anybody? Okay.
No.
Shelby, thank you. So this is what Shelby and her team are here for. We have lexicon strategies somewhere in the room. Where's Billy? Sonia, hey, Bill. we're doing a full court press to try to help all of our providers understand what services you can be providing in the community for which we can get this federal reimbursement under 4E. Because at DFACS, we need your help in providing these services. Now, for the congregate care providers, there has been, as I said earlier, a lot of fear and trembling and that sort of thing, and gnashing of teeth and wailing. Why? Because the federal government giveth and the federal government taketh away. So they said, okay, well, we'll start providing this 4A funding for these community-based services to keep families together and to keep children with their relatives, etc. But we want you to cut down on the use of congregate care. Now, why do they want that? It's a different story. That's an argument for a different day. I think there is some idea that when you get more than 6 foster children in the same place, that somehow that's bad, but if you have 6 or under, that's fine. And heaven forbid that we have a really good home like Goshen, for example, where there are lots of very happy, well cared for, well supported children who are doing just fine. This is the federal government we're talking about. But we are not really going to worry about what the federal government says. Because the law says this: we will pay you 4E funds to keep children out of foster care whenever possible, but we are not paying you 4E funds anymore starting October 2020 or so for congregate care except in certain situations. And I think the concern of our group home providers has been rightly, oh my God, they're going to pull the rug out from under us. No, we're not. We spend, how much money do we spend a year on out-of-home care, Shirley?
I'm not sure total, I don't know, but in group home it's 215.
Okay, yeah, so I can't remember, I think our out-of-home care budget is like 300
300 plus million a year.
This is huge. Of that, $15 million is federal 4E funds. Whoop-de-doo. So, if you are a good group home provider, what does that mean for you? Well, let me just be careful and not say it really does not mean continue business as usual. Because as time goes on, we likely will be reducing our use of congregate care as we reduce our overall use of foster care and as we seek to maximize our federal reimbursement. It means that some of our really larger, more well-endowed group home providers may end up becoming qualified residential treatment programs, which is what we're talking about right here. Others may, well, it's not here, but others may end up focusing on children who have been victims of trafficking, and others may decide to focus on right now we have about 680 children who are over the age of 18 who need a place to live and who are in extended foster care. So what you need to do if you're a group home provider is this. You need to figure out, where am I going? Can I be a qualified residential treatment provider? I think there's probably capacity for probably about 1,000 children per year, maybe maximum in such a situation. Or so small. Shelby says it's more like 500. Is that right?
Or less,
All right,
like
tell me how many.
300.
Okay, sorry. We have a capacity for about 300 children in qualified residential treatment placements. Okay. Now, in general, let me say this. Back, those of you who were in business in a group home before 2007, remember we actually essentially had QRTPs. Okay. They're called group homes, and what we used for our group homes were placements in which we braided. We used Medicaid funding as well as state funding to place these children, and you provided all of these wraparound services and intensive behavioral health services and other types of services, and it was great. And then we decided to bust that up and then ship off Medicaid to care management organizations and whatnot. And so we really have lost a great deal of capacity in this state for treating children who are in care who have significant behavioral health or really physical health needs as well. We are using this opportunity with Family First to try to rebuild that system. We're looking at bringing in therapeutic foster care. We're looking at bringing in sort of a more braided funding method, but the QRTPs will be part of that. And of course, if you want to be a group home provider who is focused on the over 18, you'll still have that need. And if you want to focus on the smaller population of trafficking victims, we got that too. And if you want to focus on young ladies who are pregnant or parenting, we have that too. But here's what I really want you to do. I want you to determine where you want to go, what your funding structure looks like, and then make a decision and move with it and let us help you. And those of you who decide, well, I'm not really I really can't do the QRTP thing, then especially if you've got a good funding base, if you've got a lot of nice philanthropic folks out there, then let's help you slowly diversify your business. So those of you who run group homes have gotten really good at caring for children. Who says you can't care for children in a foster care situation? Who says you can't become a CPA instead of a CCI and start caring for children in foster homes? You already know how to do this work. It's just a matter of what the business model looks like and how you do it and where you do it. If you're that good at caring for children in a group home and dealing with children who have behavioral health issues and delinquency issues and DJJ issues, and where's Sammy Roper? We're going to bring Sammy in here and have him talk about DJJ for a while. If you're good at dealing with those issues, then you can probably be good at dealing with those issues with children who are still with their parents. If we are moving to a situation in which we'll be placing more children with relatives, then we need people who can help us manage those relatives and assist those relatives. So there's plenty of work to go around, and this work will not end. And nothing that I am saying about Family First should create fear in you. Everything I'm saying about Family First should excite you about the opportunity to transition your business model so that we can get this type of funding to continue to care for our children. Okay, so I know I skipped over a lot of that, sorry. If you want to know the details of what you need to do, then you need to talk to Juanita, and you need to talk to Shelby, and you need to talk to me, and we'll come sit down and talk with you any day. Or you can talk to Mary Havoc, or Tammy Reed. We have lots of people here that know what they're talking about, other than me. But here is the bottom line. DFACS is an agency. DFACS is going to have a different director at some point. The average tenure of the DFACS director in Georgia is about 22 months. I hope to heck I get to stay longer than that. Because I love what I do and I love this work. So you as providers are working with a bureaucracy that is a lot of times hard to deal with. So when the federal government tells the state bureaucracy that we need to change our method of doing business and focus more on family preservation, on relative placements, and on services that are approved and evidence-based to keep children out of foster care and to keep them from coming into foster care, then no matter what I say up here today, y'all are going to have to make some transitions in your business model, in your way of doing business. So let me give you a couple of ideas. Katie Hooks, who was a foster parent in Emmanuel County, used to always have this idea of having granny homes. And I said, what's a granny home, Katie? And she said, well, instead of removing the child from the family, we just send somebody in to live with the family. You could have lots of families together. You could have people to work with them. And so I came up with the other day, I came up with this idea that if we could buy about 5 or 6 extended stay motels and kick out the riffraff and put a couple of social workers on site, and then if you had a family who was facing homelessness, had a drug issue, et cetera, we'd bring all those families in and we'd watch over them, we'd watch over their children, and we'd keep that family together, and we could get 4E money for it. Yeah. We have significant issues with children who have autism, behavioral issues. We have parents who are cognitively delayed or cognitively deprived. It's a shame that we have to separate children from families in such situations, and if we can build up services to help these families and keep these families together and help these children without either having to bring the child into care because the parent has a cognitive issue, or without having to separate the parent and the child because the parent just cannot deal with the child's sexualized behavior anymore, then we can do a whole lot of good. Folks, there are a hell of a lot of services out there that we don't provide in the state. And it is not going to be DFACS that says to you, do these services. It is going to be you knowing your communities, knowing the need in your communities, knowing the struggles, the challenges, the opportunities, and the strengths of your communities, who are going to come to us and say, we should do this. And I can assure you that at least right now, and even if my head gets chopped off tomorrow, you have people at DFACS who are going to say, my God, that is an interesting idea. How can we help you to implement that? Our role as a state agency, again, is not to tell you what services to provide. It is to help you provide the services that you know are needed in your community. And let us do so with this structure in mind. How do we keep from removing how do we avoid removing that child from his family, friends, school? Well, first of all, we can put more foster homes where we need them in the local community. Anybody up in Glenn County? We need really a lot of foster homes in Glenn County. Just give you that. Morning Star, I think y'all have. We can do more services to help extended family who are caring for a relative child, either through our voluntary kinship program or through our situations in which we have custody of the child but we place with a relative. We can all join in with my friend Dahlia Brown's State of Hope program, in which we are attempting to build across this state greater local community capacity to address the needs of families and children who are vulnerable. So my promise to you today is that everything's going to change. You already knew that. And that we are ready, willing, and able to work with you through these changes and to support you through these changes. And I am not about to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Because no matter how much money the legislature or the federal government gives me, y'all are the ones, in many cases, who are not only using that money, but adding your own blood, sweat, tears, and philanthropic contributions. And you're leveraging what we give you to create these services. And I am very thankful for you. So I guess Shelby, now Shelby's going to interrogate me. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. So thank you.
You actually covered a good number of kind of the initial questions I was going to ask you, and I think you set this.
As usual, I screwed it up.
No, but you set it up well, and a lot of times, a lot of you have heard me talk about Family First in terms of Family First, the act, and Family First, the opportunity. And a lot of what Director Rawlings is talking about today is the opportunity that the state of Georgia and other states have as there's this national shift towards looking at how we can prevent removal to foster care, looking how we can shift our work upstream to be doing primary prevention. And then Family First, the Act, is a federal funding tool to do this, but there are a good number of limitations in the Act. And so today, what I think we're going to talk about is some of the specifics of Family First, what that allows us to do, and what our plans in Georgia are for implementing those specific provisions, because they're not distinct conversations, but what we can do under the Act is a part of what we can do as a part of this larger vision. So the first question is, when are we implementing Family First?
So we anticipate that as of October, really a year from now, October of 2020, will be implemented, which means essentially that we will be able to pull down this 4E funding to provide these services, and that we will conversely not be able to use 4E funding for the typical congregate care. But two caveats. Number one is that we don't anticipate that we're going to have these services everywhere. That will be a longer growth process. And number two, if you're running a congregate care home, we're still going to need you. We don't have the capacity. We still need that capacity. And we sure as hell aren't going to cut you off and throw you out maybe with bad work. So that's key.
And also, another key point to that is the changes to Shines that you talked about and how those important those are for tracking services and making eligibility determinations. Probably won't be done until probably October 2021 is our target date for that, so that impacts.
So we're going to have to do a lot of manual tracking of this stuff, and I think for a while. So we're really, we're easing into it. But I think the key is that we're going to go ahead and pull the trigger as soon as we can, knowing that our aim may be a little bit off. Okay. So as with everything I do, we're shooting from the hip, folks.
But I think that a key point is what you said about not all services won't be available in every place starting October 2020, is that this is going to be a staged implementation over time. We're not going to all wake up one morning in October 2020, October 2021, and everything is going to look different. This is something that's going to be built over time.
This is going to be built slowly. But again, so if we go ahead and we start, we go ahead and commit to doing the work, and commit to making the changes, then we don't want to kick the can down the road. We cannot sit here and say, let's wait as long as possible to do what we already know we should be doing, which is keeping children with their community, their family, their parents as much as possible. So that's the urgency in going ahead and committing to doing it.
And I think to your point also, is that there's a lot of work in that direction that can be done outside of technically what's under Family First. There's still ways to transition the focus of your work to family preservation without necessarily shifting funding.
Correct.
So what are the next steps for implementation?
Let's see. So we're doing a pilot, and I think that's in
Jackson,
North Georgia, in Jackson County, and also Whitfield. So we're kind of piloting some of this work already, starting out kind of now. And the way we're doing that is we're just basically trying to figure out, you know, if we run a pilot, you run kind of a test site, you say, okay, well, how is this actually going to work? Like, how good are we at defining candidates for foster care? What does that look like in reality? What kind of documentation is needed? How are we going to document whether a practice is reimbursable? So that's kind of what we're doing now. We'll be doing that, I think, from now on through on. So.
Yeah. And something, when I talk to providers about Family First, we focus more on the 4A requirements around the services, but there are really, really extensive 4A requirements for our work. And our ability to get the $40 is contingent on our agency's ability to do some of the things that Director Rawlings talked about, such as document candidacy effectively, track ongoing safety assessments, doing case planning. All of that work has to be done and done well in order for us to be able to access this funding stream. So that's what we're really looking at in the pilot.
And Shelby, I think along those lines, you and I talked, in fact, this morning you asked me to sign a letter to the federal government to add some of our current practices to that clearinghouse. Do you recall what those practices were?
It's it's about 21 services, so I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but we got feedback from providers, and we worked with DBHTD also to identify services that are currently being offered in the state. So we're submitting that. There was a public call for services from the 4A Prevention Services Clearinghouse, and we wanted to suggest as many as possible because they haven't given us a clear indication of how they'll prioritize the ratings or anything around that, so we thought we should just include as many as possible. And hopefully in the slides that we had, they showed you the ones that are currently under review. This is getting a little ahead, but there's been some delay. The federal government, this wasn't an administration bill. This was passed, lobbied for by advocates, and the Children's Bureau, our federal partners, weren't really necessarily ready to implement this too. So the law passed in February of 2018, and we didn't know which services, the first list of approved services wasn't available until April of 2019. They now have about, I think, 16 more services under review. They haven't given us a time frame for when those will be done. So there's been some delays in terms of getting guidance from our federal partners around what services we can use. And right now, you know, we submitted a list of 21 services. There are only 11 on the clearinghouse. So to start out with, we do have a smaller number to choose from.
So just to follow up, so these are the in-home parenting services that have been cleared and are under review. These are the current substance abuse treatment and prevention things that are cleared and also under review, and then mental health services as well. One of the, I think it's important to say that one of the most basic things that everyone can do, and I'm pretty sure it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's already on the clearinghouse, is cognitive behavioral therapy. Everybody can do cognitive behavioral therapy. When I was in Guatemala, we trained lay people to do it, frankly. And it is a very good service and the kind of thing we should be thinking about, especially if it's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes. And another thing with the services, I feel like you're setting me up to play good cop, bad cop. with me coming back in with the federal requirements around this, is that trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy is supported, or is it promising? And so 50% of our expenditures have to be towards well-supported practices, which is.
But Shelby, I can tell you that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is like the best thing since sliced bread. In fact, when I worked at IJM, we selected that as our model for treating victims of child sexual abuse because it was so effective. Are you telling me the federal government doesn't agree with me?
Yes. They have,
What do we do about changing that, Shelby? How do we get the federal government to agree with us on these things?
So there is actually pending in Congress a Family First Transitional, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but there's an act pending to provide some support to states during this transition period that would change some of the requirements around the well-supported funding so that states have more options for the services that are available. But there is, all of their rating and review criteria is publicly available. It's incredibly complex. I can't even begin to try to understand it, but all of that is on the Clearinghouse website for those of you who are service providers, if you're interested in trying to see what might be the criteria.
And I think this also brings up the important fact that, as I said earlier, DFACS doesn't, we're going to provide the services that our providers have advocated for and show us work. So I think all of these folks have an opportunity as well to lobby Congress, to lobby the clearinghouse people. And I will say this, that it's kind of weird because if you look at this from a state bureaucratic viewpoint, there are two, it's almost like having a split personality here. So I think Shelby and I agree with everybody that we need, and in fact, Jerry Milner, who's the head of the Children's Bureau, he's like, I don't care, I just want good services. I don't care if they're evidence-based or not. But then there's the other part where we have to say, if we don't have these well-supported services, then we can't get the money. So it's kind of it is sort of a bit of a catch-22. But I think these folks need to understand that if they have a service that they think works, we can help you to advocate for that service with the Federal Clearinghouse and with others. And I think we've actually talked about doing some, trying to support some internal in-state studies of these types of services as well, correct?
We did have some initial conversations around that, and I think something that we will have a better understanding of after this public call for services is rated is, so it can take up to 10 years to become an evidence-based program in terms of the number of research, the types of studies that have to be done. So I think that that's something that we can look at investing in, but that's a longer-term goal if we want to do the kind of ongoing evaluation that gets you to outcomes over time. And so around picking the services, that is one of the next steps in implementation. We are first going to be looking this fall, hopefully by the end of January, have a definition of candidacy. There are a number of other states that have come up with a definition for candidacy, and I put Utah's up as an example because Utah took one approach, which is looking at the characteristics of the children and families who might be considered candidates. Other states have taken a slightly different approach and have said if a family meets, X level of risk on our initial risk assessment, then they would be considered candidates. So those are two ways of structuring these definitions, and once we have our definition, then that will give us a better sense also of the target population that we want to serve with these programs.
And on the issue of candidacy, I think we need to point out this. About a year and a half ago, we started doing what we call our pre-team consultations, and really did them really aside from any discussion of FFPSA. But what we are doing is whenever, it's at least in about half of those regions now, whenever the county wants to remove a child to foster care, we're getting kind of a statewide team involved. It also involves Austin Child Advocate in discussing alternatives. And we have also, of course, as many of you know, have enacted a new law that requires courts, prior to placing a child in foster care, to consider temporary alternatives to foster care, such as a protective order to keep somebody out of the house, placing the child temporarily just in the voluntary custody of a relative, that sort of thing. And my anticipation, Shelby, is that the work we're doing around those areas will help us better define candidacy, because we know that if we are considering removing a child from the home, that child is certainly a candidate for foster care. And if we can say we have considered it and we have avoided it, then we should have no problem getting the 4A funds to keep that child in the home.
And I think that's a great point, because one of the considerations around a definition for candidacy is how broad do we want it to be, and how many children do we want to be included in that population. And I think we do have to have some way, while we want all families to have access to services, we do have other mechanisms, like through our family support services, to link families to services. And with this, there is going to be, I think, the federal government has said that they're not going to further define the term imminent risk of entering foster care, but we do know that we're going to have some sort of criteria in place. So, for example, a pre-team staffing is a clear indication that there is risk for removal.
Okay.
And so back to the services, after we define the definition of candidacy, we'll be looking at which services we want to include, because another layer of the services have to be rated and approved and on the clearinghouse, but then they also have to be in our state's approved 4A plan that we submit to the Children's Bureau for them to be reimbursable in Georgia. So we'll look at what our definition of candidacy is, what those services that are available in which ones we want to include in our 4A plan. And I think to the point that you've been talking about is that conversation is really part of a larger conversation about service array and what services we want to have available for children and families in our state. Because as you can see, right now we have 11 services to choose from. So those would be the only ones that we could initially choose to include on our 4A plan. But as we're doing that, I think we'll probably start to see some gaps and say, this is what's 4A reimbursable and we want to use this, but it appears that we don't have enough services to meet X need or Y need. So then we need to start looking at how we're going to fill in those needs, potentially with other funding sources, and choosing those programs. And in terms of QRTPs, you talked about them a little bit, and can you talk a little bit more about what you think the role of QRTPs is in the placement continuum?
So right now we have a lot of gaps. So let's think about, I would say that the vast majority of the children we bring into foster care they're just typical children. They have some trauma, they need some treatment, etc. But we have probably, I think, about maybe up to 20% of our children who have higher needs. And to give you an example, we have at any time about 50 children who we are not able to even find a suitable placement for because their needs are so high. And so what I anticipate is that as we build a larger continuum of care, that we have foster homes, that we have therapeutic foster care, including respite care, so that families don't have to give up custody of their child to get that child's services. And then, of course, our highest end is the PRTF, the Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility. But I think the QRTP will fit below that. These are going to be children with who have very high-end needs, primarily behavioral health, developmental disability type needs, I think. And they'll be reimbursable because the QRTP providers will have skilled people on staff to do this work, to treat the child and stabilize the child so they can then be stepped down to a lower level of care. And I would anticipate that some of them may be coming from the psychiatric residential treatment facility or being stepped up. Or they may be children who just come in, they've been victimized severely, they have significant behavioral health issues, and they really need a stabilizing placement. The hard part on that, not the hard part, the details that make this a little complicated are that, and we've already put this in the law, if you want to look at the new law on QRTPs, it's out there. But we have to have an assessment done by an independent agency, can't be the provider, the QRTP provider. We have to have the court to determine this child needs a QRTP placement. And we have to have very regular court reviews of the child's placement so that we don't have children staying in a QRTP for a long-term placement.
I'm really glad that you talked about them as a part of the continuum. I'm looking at Tammy Reed, our Director of Placement and Permanency, and something that she brings up a lot is that QRTPs are the placement piece in Family First that gets a lot of attention, a lot of people are talking about them, a lot of people are focused on them, but ultimately they're going to be a really small piece of our placement continuum, and they're specialized treatment settings. They're not a type of placement where any child who enters foster care, that's not going to be an appropriate placement for them. The requirements for what the programs themselves have are very stringent. The requirements for placement and the assessment is really stringent. So I think it is important, and I think when the law passed both in Georgia and nationally, there was kind of some misunderstanding of, oh, does this just mean that all group homes will become QRTPs? And that absolutely wouldn't be appropriate, because we have a lot of children and youth in group homes who do well in community settings, who go to school, and they don't need this level of treatment. So it really is just a piece of the continuum. And you also mentioned Medicaid in relation to QRTPs. Do you want to talk about the Medicaid 4E institution of mental disease?
So we've got a couple of opportunities here, a couple of obstacles. So first of all, the federal government, the ACF, the Administration for Children and Families, has decided that 4E should be the payer of last resort, which means that a lot of these services should be paid for by Medicaid. The dilemma we have is that when Georgia shifted to the care management organization structure, we did not necessarily place these types of services in the Medicaid plan. And so the dilemma we're going to have is this. So if I, as a state defects director, or somebody working for me, decides that a child or an adult needs X, Y, and Z, first of all, is the adult on Medicaid? Is the adult on insurance? I now have to work with the insurer or the Medicaid agency or the care management organization to figure out whether or not they'll pay for it. They're going to have their own medical necessity requirements. If they don't pay for it, then of course 4E may. But it does complicate the situation. The other thing that complicates the situation is that there has been a long-standing rule in Medicaid called the Institute for Mental Disease exception. And if you essentially, a QRTP may fall under this category according to Medicaid. And so we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We're saying we're going to place this child in a home, a residential treatment placement, because they need help. And then Medicaid comes along and says, oh, you're placing them in an institution for mental defect or disease, and we're not paying for it. So that's a complicating factor for it, and I don't think anybody around the country has figured that one out yet.
They haven't, and that's part of a national conversation that's happening. And I think an important piece of the Medicaid won't pay for it is it's not only that Medicaid won't pay for services in that placement, it means that child is not eligible for Medicaid funding, period.
Right.
So if they broke their arm and had to go to the emergency room, they wouldn't have insurance.
Crazy.
And we're not, and so we do have a lot of concerns about that in terms of the implications, and certainly before working with providers to change their program structures, because we know that that's going to be an investment and that's going to be time consuming. We've had some initial conversations with the Department of Community Health, and we've gotten now linked to their Health Facility Regulation Division, and are going to be having conversations with them so that we get as much clarity as we can before moving forward with trying to make any changes around QRTPs. And I think we probably will have to have some discussions with providers to help facilitate those conversations with DCH so that we know exactly what programs would look like, so DCH can tell us whether or not they would fit into it. But I think that's going to cause an unanticipated delay in terms of moving forward with this, because we thought we were ready to go and start looking at, you know, how these programs would be structured, how we would move forward with them, but we want to make sure that this is addressed before moving forward. And you've mentioned therapeutic foster care and some other work. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, so one of the things we see a significant need for is true certified therapeutic foster care. So in the past, I think we actually kind of had that more, because we were back before 2007, we had these bundled services, and we had great providers that would give the child a place to stay, but they would also have very well qualified foster parents, in-home behavioral health services, etc. Since we've broken that system up, we now have this vague notion, and there are foster care agencies that say that they're providing therapeutic foster care, but what they mean is all foster care is therapeutic. And there are other agencies that I would very well trust tomorrow as certifying as a therapeutic foster care agency. So what we need to do is we need to look at two different things. We need to, number one, look at building a certification process for providers who want to supply us with highly qualified, well-trained foster parents who are able to address children with significant behavioral health needs, significant negative behaviors. Number two, we need to work with our Medicaid agency, DCH, and with our legislature and our provider community to advocate for adding therapeutic foster care and similar services to the state Medicaid plan. Why? Because there are a number of states in which therapeutic foster care is a Medicaid service. Think parts of California, Tennessee, North Carolina, New Jersey, etc. If you are a parent who has a child with, say for example, a combination of autism and significant behavioral issues, you don't run into the situation where you're constantly calling the ER and constantly going to the crisis stabilization unit, etc., only to have the child sent back home with you. You actually are able to access therapeutic foster care for this child. You're actually also able to access respite care so that you can get a break from dealing with this issue for a period of time and recharge your energy to then address the needs of your behaviorally disturbed child.
And we are having initial conversations at this point at the state level around that.
We are.
Yeah. And I think that's something around the placement piece of Family First, that the challenge is that it lists this ideal of family-based care, of using congregate care for certain settings, but then there's not any additional funding under the Act to support what we're then able to identify as the gaps in our placement continuum. So that's a lot of system change work that needs to happen to support Family First.
But I can assure you that if we could build in therapeutic foster care, we would save, the state would save the money. We would pay for ourselves by saving the money, because we spend a great deal of money right now among several agencies in dealing with children in behavioral health crises, mental health crises.
And you already talked about HB 472, which is the alternatives to foster care to you. And the way that this relates to Family First also is that you're allowed to use the 4A prevention services funding for parents or kin caregivers of children who are candidates for foster care. So a child using HB 472 to get a protective order on a child, that child can still be considered a candidate, so we'd be able to use the 4A prevention services for this family.
Yeah. And I think the key there, Shelby, is that we traditionally have had a situation where if a child, if we weren't sure we could keep a child safe, we would call the judge and say, please place this child in foster care. And a significant number of children would then go home under a protective order or some other arrangement at the 72-hour hearing. Now, under Family First, that's shooting ourselves in the foot, because that means that child is no longer, if they go back home, they're no longer eligible for these 4A services, probably. But if we can keep them out of custody, we can do better by the child. We can of course start accessing these funds to keep them out of here.
So I think everything else that I had talked about, but I really appreciated also the message that you gave to providers about what you would do. I had a question, what would you do right now if you're a provider? I think you addressed that.
Okay. And of course, if y'all want to talk about this, if you've got any questions, we can answer specific questions as well.
Yeah. So I think I will give just a really brief recap, and I just yesterday submitted to Director Rawlings a draft of a plan that's an overview implementation plan that will outline some of these key dates and high points that we're talking about, and that will be shared once it's gotten approval, both internally and then also with our stakeholders. But really the next steps for the prevention services are the defining candidacy and selecting the initial services. And we would like to have that done by the spring of 2020. With QRTPs, we're having the conversations with DCH right now, and we will keep you updated on where those are going. If we need to pull providers into those conversations, we certainly will reach out and do that. But those are the immediate next steps with implementing the technical pieces of Family First. And so if, we can take questions. Is there a microphone that can? Okay.
Questions?
Got a question.
Sure. Zach?
Will the services, especially kind of on the preventative side, will those be court mandated, or will it be a choice of the parent whether they will participate in those services?
So that's a good question. So think about this, okay? If a child is a candidate for foster care, the idea is that but for these services, this child will be in foster care. So I anticipate that a lot of these children will be under a court-ordered case plan. So they would be court mandated. I can see them also perhaps being voluntary, but I think the idea for us is that if you don't do what we need you to do, your child's going to be in foster care.
The mic's going back there.
I'd like to know on the mental health side and substance abuse side of these evidence-based treatments. I'm looking at the list and I don't see some of the best ones there in my opinion. Should we start training based on what they got now, or should we wait until see if some of the more, like EMDR is not even on the list? That's one for trauma, that's one of the most effective treatment modalities there are as far as mental health. And I mean, that's what I am as a mental health provider. Should we start training on this multi-systematic thing, or should we wait and see what comes into the clearinghouse later? I mean, we can't wait till last minute and all of a sudden have to train clinicians.
So going back to these substance abuse, MST, MAT, families facing the future, PCIT, et cetera. I think the model here is going to be somewhat related to kind of when juvenile justice did its juvenile reinvestment grants, that they said you have to pick some evidence-based local services to keep the child out of a commitment or out of detention. The concern and the challenge is that, as I said earlier, so trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is to be a really good one. I don't know, I think, who in here provides MST? I know Cindy does. I think that Chris 180 is probably providing training on that. But the truth of the matter is, it's going to take us probably 5 years to build the appropriate network for providing these services. I think my promise is to y'all is that if you want to provide these services, we will help you figure out how to do that. Yeah.
Well, if you're already providing EMDR, that funding won't go away. If you're already working with our clients and offering EMDR, that funding wouldn't go away. It would just mean we can't access the 4A prevention services funding for it. And I think that is something that when we're selecting services for our 4A plan, we are going to pull from what's on the clearinghouse, but we don't want to pull them just because they're on the clearinghouse. We want to include them because we think that they'll be an effective service for the population we're trying to target. But that doesn't mean that other services that we're already paying for won't also be available to kids and families. And again, there's no time frame for it, but EMDR is one of the services that we are including on our request for review and inclusion on the clearinghouse.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon. My question is duplicate of services. So we are a tier 2 provider and we do bill Medicaid services. We are not authorized fee for service, we're just a tier 2. And I'm wondering, when we're talking about these preventive mental health services that are going to be put into place in that candidate type of way, what if a tier 2 provider or even a tier 3 is even in there with the family already? How are you going to identify those children and what will happen as a tier 2 provider?
So I guess I'm not, so if you're already offering them the prevention services and then they're identified as a candidate?
Sure. And so really it comes down to boots on the ground.
So
How will the people that will be asking for these services, how will they be able to go into the system? Maybe MMIS, maybe find out if they have already a tier 2. Will that be allowed? Will we be allowed to stay in there and continue to provide continuity of care, the continuation of care, or will we be asked to hand off to somebody that you identify?
I mean, for continuity of care, if it's a Medicaid provider, I don't think we would want to switch providers because at that point also we would have to bill Medicaid first too before we could start even considering accessing 4A funding. I think this is a specific question that, honestly at this point we haven't considered because I don't think that a lot of times when we intervene with families that there are services in place. We're usually initiating services from the first time, so that's something that's a consideration going forward. But if a Medicaid provider were already working with a family, we wouldn't want to disrupt continuity of services.
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know why on earth would change providers in midstream. We'll work it out. Remember, a lot of services where currently this is an additional bucket of money to use and to access. a lot of the services we're already providing, we provide either through state dollars or through Medicaid or through TANF. And so I think that I don't see why we go and ditch what we're already doing. This is sort of additional.
You guys,
Question around funding. You currently have multiple lines of funding that's available to
wraparound assessment services, you know, all of those type of things. Is there discussions to begin to leverage that? Because you talked about there not being a significant amount of 4E money that's involved. So is there thoughts of leveraging all the money that exists now, inclusive of Medicaid funding?
So that's a good question. So we have a whole lot of buckets of money right now, and we're providing, y'all are providing a hell of a lot of services to our children. I think the challenge for us is going to be figuring out how to braid different funding sources into the 4E. So let's just give you, let me give you an example, I guess, try to give you an example. So let's say Shelby is able to get up to the point where she has all these well-supported services that we can, you know, get 4E funding for. But we have a child down in Hayhira who is a candidate for foster care, but there is no MST provider in that particular area. But there is an intensive family intervention provider, or there is a cognitive behavioral therapy provider, or there is, you know, something like that. Then we would, I think, continue to provide those services through our current funding. So in the same way, you go that we are going to continue to support our group home providers with state dollars, because the $15 million we get from 4E for group homes ain't that big a chunk. Then I think that we will still, because we're a TANF-funded child welfare system for the most part, we will continue to provide all of these services that, regardless of whether they're on the clearinghouse or not. The key, I think, will be for that population that is a candidate, making sure that we leverage to the greatest extent possible those 4E dollars to bring additional services to that community or that population. Does that make sense?
and I think the question you ask is getting at a larger point, which is, I think true both on the placement side and the prevention services side of, are we just inserting these into our existing continuum, or are we shifting our existing continuum? And I think that on the prevention services side, especially since building capacity is going to happen over time, we can't remove any of the other availability of services to replace them. We need to make sure that we have all of those services available to kids and families statewide. And then as we build more of the prevention services and as more programs are available and this becomes, I think, more of a robust infrastructure, then I think that's when we would talk about shifting all of the services on the front end. But I think that's something that's farther out.
And I think the bigger picture here is this. You know, how do we treat children? Okay. What is the appropriate number of children that should be in foster care? Anybody got an idea? Let me give you a number.
The exact number who needs to be in care.
Not one more. That's what Judge Key says. Okay. So I think what we're looking at here is how do we expand our continuum of services and our continuum of approaches so that we are able to treat children as close to their family as possible. And so, although it's not really a family first issue perhaps, that's the whole idea behind our efforts to, or that you'll see more of, I hope, to look at our foster care system, and not in terms of the numbers of foster homes we have, but where those homes are located. You know, I talked to somebody just yesterday about one county in which we have a lot of children in foster care, but we have very few foster homes there. And that's where we need them. Because otherwise, these case managers are having to drive to, you know, Atlanta or someplace else to see a child. And that's stupid, you know. It's financially irresponsible for us, and it's not good for the child.
And this is something I just realized we did talk a little bit about the pilot, but we spent a little less time talking about the impact that this will have on our agency's work. And I know that that's a concern that a lot of people have. It's something that we are really trying to do is make sure that any changes we make are meaningful and intentional, and that it's not just an addition of new work, that it's shifting work so that it is all part of something consistent that makes sense. And we really don't want this just to be an add-on to what we're already doing. We want it to be integrated into the work that we're doing and only make changes that really need to be made because they'll improve our engagement with families and the outcomes that we get for children and families. We don't want to make changes to our practice just because it's a 4A compliance issue. And we are working really, really hard on that with our internal work.
Other questions? It's like light here.
Yes.
Hello? There you are.
Just a quick question. What should CPAs be doing right now to prepare for this?
CPA?
Tammy, you want Tammy to, you want to answer Tammy?
Tom, go ahead, unless you want me to answer.
Are you answering, Tammy, or you want me to?
I'll answer. He can follow up. I'm sure he'll say it much more eloquently than I will. But a lot of what Director Rollins has talked about, has already talked about, is what I would suggest. So I would suggest taking a look at how you're able to serve local kids in their local communities. I would take a look at where you want your CPA continuum to go in terms of moving towards more therapeutic care or focusing on a specialized population or not. And then I will add one that Director Rollins hasn't yet talked about, but very closely ties into our values, and that is really examining and strengthening how your programs work with birth family, so that your foster parents are not seen as a substitute caregiver, but a significant primary support to the birth family and perhaps caregivers, so that the family can be successfully unified as quickly as possible. Tom, you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that if I were running a CPA, just in the future, here's what the things I would be looking at. Number one, how can we better utilize the social workers and case managers that you have to help us do our work? So, just give you an example, okay? Let's just say we pay you $50 a day for keeping a child for us, and of course, you do a lot of case management with that. One thing we don't do a good job of right now is capturing your documentation in our files. We don't do a good job necessarily of collaborating with y'all so that we're not duplicating the services. So, for example, you know, maybe your case manager can visit the child and family and work with the family, so that it takes a bit of a load off our people. And so we have to do the same work. We really need to be looking at add-on services that we could perhaps pay extra for, such as transportation and visitation supervision and working with and mentoring birth parents, for example. So I think there's opportunity there. I think what we have, and this is maybe Mary and Tammy disagree with me on this, I don't know, but I think we have to some extent, siloed our CPAs as providers of foster care alone, and we're not taking full advantage of the other services that y'all could be assisting us with and also getting some payment for. So we're looking at, actually currently in the process of looking at our foster care system and what our foster caregivers give, but or do and give, both our internal and our CPA foster parents. The other issue that concerns me a little bit is that we have in this state 102, and I keep saying this, but just this number sticks out to me, 102 different providers of foster care, recruitment, retention, and training and education services, so impact training and whatnot. It just seems that there's not a lot of coordination across the CPAs, across the foster care universe. And I guess the final thing that I would be doing as a CPA, if you're not doing it, is please try the best you can to team up with some of these foster care support organizations. Foster Care Foundation, Call to Care, Promise 686, Chosen for Life, that are providing to anyone, really to any foster parent who asks, these additional support services, support groups, laundry service, babysitting, etc. And I think the final thing to think about is, in terms of, well, there's two final things. Number one is, and I think Tammy mentioned this, but we're doing a poor job as a state agency, I think, of letting you know, as CPAs, where we need homes. We talk all the time about keeping children near their community of origin. We talk all the time about recruiting foster parents, but I don't think we do a very good job of saying we have X number of children who are placed out of this county and that we need to bring back to this county. And helping you to recruit foster homes in that community where we need them. That's one thing we need to do a better job of, working with y'all, and we can. And I think the final thing is just the general concept that when if you're a CPA, look at what else you could be doing other than providing foster care services. What other kind of case management, transportation, visitation, behavioral health, I don't know, whatever it may be. What other kind of services could you provide so that we could really get you more involved in this work? And especially since it's a whole lot easier to have one team working with a family as opposed to having 16 different providers.
Mentioning documentation from CPAs also reminded me, I don't know that I was explicit that when I talk about Shine's changes, we're also talking about updates to the provider portal, so that not just RBWO providers, but delivered service providers would also have access to interface with Shines, and hopefully automating invoicing and making all of that better. That's part of the plan for updating Shines. That's not going to happen next week, but that is part of the discussion, is expanding the capabilities of the provider portal to make it more functional and streamline this work. And I will ask, I guess, one final question. What do you think the key to successful implementation of Family First will be in Georgia?
This is fun. So Shelby, the key to successful implementation of Family First is that you do a really good job. I just want to kind of close this. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of days ago who runs one of the advocacy organizations, and she said that wherever she goes, people say, and Family First makes you do this, and Family First is going to make us do this, and Family First is going to do. It's like Family First is like the fairy dust of everything. It fixes everything. I think the key to successful implementation is going to be our agency recognizing that we have a duty and an obligation to the providers to bring y'all along and help you through this process. There are a lot of moving parts to it. The one thing that I will say that I am concerned about is that I think working with y'all as a bridge, it'll be easy compared to the fact that we also have to get other state agencies and the federal government to do their part. So that's really where the hard part's going to come in. I think the Medicaid issues are difficult. I think the licensing and service array provisions that other agencies have make things a little bit complicated. But in general, I want to go back to, I'll summarize with this one little thing, okay? And this is, this is it, okay? So traditional 4E incentivize the role of the state agency of DFACS as the big daddy who came in and pulled the child out of the home and fixed everything. Okay? The idea, of course, is that foster care is a solution. And folks, I love foster parents, I love foster care, I love foster care providers. But I think we all have to recognize that foster care is a necessary step when we cannot keep a child safe in his or her home or with his or her parents. But when we do take that step, we should do so with fear and trembling because we are invading the province of much older, deeper, wiser institutions. The family, the church, the community, the neighborhood, the tribe, the DNA. How many of you today would like for me to come to your house and say, I don't know what you got going on, but you're coming with me to Atlanta and you're going to live in my house? I got a nice house. What's wrong? Does anybody want to come live with me? Now, forget your job, forget your friends. Don't worry, we'll let you see your children occasionally. You got or your spouse. We'll have arranged visits. No conjugal visits, so you know that. To be supervised. And the reason to supervise you, make sure you don't have any contact with your spouse or your significant other. And if you do have a significant other who's not married to you, we have to vet them, okay? Now, I know that party you wanted to go to the other day, or next week, the one that you have a new dress for, and you're all excited about because you're going to see your high school reunion, your 30th high school reunion, and you're going to show those people up who are not nice to you. Okay. I'm sorry that you can't go to that because we don't have the ability to transport you back down to Savannah to do that. Okay? You're going to have to stay at my house. So, the bottom line is this. This is not a question of group home, foster care, family, whatever. It is a question of what do these children have the right to. And children have the right to be cared for and to care for others around them in a free state. So that if they want to go to the party, they don't have somebody vetting everybody. If they want to go hang out at school with their friends, they can do so, as long as they're not getting in trouble. If they want to run around the block and not be supervised for a while, that's fine too. If they want to ride their bike to school, that's fine too. But when we bring them into foster care, despite our reasonable parenting standard, folks, we have difficulty giving them the freedom that they deserve and the ability to have the relationships with those closest to them that they want. Only exception to that, the only exception, is that whenever and we need to do a better job of this, whenever we have a situation where we identify that a parent is not going to shape up or has done something so terrible to the child that it shocks the conscience, we need to get that child out of that situation permanently. And that's where we're moving as a state agency, to the idea that if children can be kept safe in their home and their community, we're going to do everything we can. But if a child cannot be kept safe there, and there's not a reasonable likelihood that they can return to a safe parental custody situation, we're going to start pulling the plug, fishing or cutting bait, crapping or getting off the pot, whatever you want to call it, okay? And I know I'm being a little strong here, but I mean it. We're going to have to start taking the child's right to a safe, stable family very seriously. And so the joy of this work, what I love about this work, is that y'all are the ones who provide that. Whether you're providing it as a service provider, counselor, group home, foster provider, whatever, you're part of this system. And as long as, and I think we all share these wonderful goals. We may share, we may not, we may differ from time to time on how to get there. God, this is fun. And it's meaningful. Does anybody here hate their job? From day to day, okay? But in general, don't we have a wonderful freaking job? Don't we have a wonderful, wonderful ability to help people? I just love this stuff. I love y'all. Thank you.